Now, as the year comes to an end, the US faces a grim reality. It was a year of botched executions for the country. The US Capital Punishment's annual review has now revealed shocking details. As it turns out, more than a third of the execution attempts were visibly problematic. Many of them were agonizingly drawn out to a point that lawyers describe them as a form of torture. The US predominantly uses lethal injections to execute inmates. Lethal drugs are injected into their veins. The method was first used in Texas on December 7th, back in 1982. Convicted murderer Charles Brooks was given a fatal dose of sodium thiopental. The use of lethal injections marked its 40th year this month. But 40 years on, it seems that the states are still not learning how to use them properly. 7 of the 20 execution attempts carried out this year were botched. In Alabama, the past 3 executions didn't go as planned. Joe Nathan James was sentenced to death for murdering his ex-girlfriend. He was supposed to be executed in July. But when the execution team tried to do the deed, they struggled for 3 hours to set an intravenous line. Imagine that. Something similar happened to Alan Miller and Kenneth Smith. The team could not find a workable vein to inject the drugs. Ultimately, their death warrants expired and the executions were called off. Miller sued several state officials, calling the execution attempt unconstitutional. Due to 3 failed executions, Alabama's governor has sought a pause in executions. She ordered a top-to-bottom review of the state's capital punishment system. Another harrowing example is that of Clarence Dixon. Dixon was sentenced to death in 2008 for a killing that happened 3 decades ago. He was blind, physically frail, and had a documented history of severe mental illness. According to Dixon's lawyers, he didn't have a rational understanding of why he was being executed. In May, the attempt to put him down ended in a bloody mess, and I mean that literally. Executioners tried to set the IV for 20 minutes, and then, when that didn't work out, they made an incision in his groin area to reach a vein. Note that this cut down was completely unauthorized. The execution was declared complete 10 minutes later. But Arizona did not learn the lesson. A month later, the executioners again struggled to set the lethal injection tubes. At this point, it raises concerns. Are US executioners really that incompetent? The prisoner, Frank Atwood, ended up giving advice to the IV team. He suggested ways to find a suitable vein in his own body to finally kill him and end the slow and painful torture. Should the family of prisoners be subjected to such trauma? Is it fair for correctional personnel to witness such torture? And above all, do prisoners really deserve such agonizing deaths? It's a debate for another day. But let me say this. I'm not undermining their crimes or the pain of people who were wronged by them. But why drag out something that can be handled in a more dignified way? The review highlights a key factor that was common in all these botched procedures. Some of the states maintained an air of secrecy to avoid any accountability. Idaho, Florida, and Mississippi introduced new laws that further obscure how these executions are carried out. This includes hiding the source of the lethal drugs that they aim to sidestep. Do they aim to sidestep court scrutiny by doing this? Lethal injections appear to be headed towards a crisis, and so does the entirety of the death penalty in America. Earlier this week, the governor of Oregon, Kate Brown, struck down 17 death sentences. She condemned the inmates to life imprisonment without parole instead. Brown said that death penalty is immoral. She believes it is an irreversible punishment that does not leave room for redemption. 27 states technically still have the ultimate punishment on their books, but in practice, only 6 of them actually executed prisoners this year. 2022 also marked the fewest death sentences in nearly 3 decades. In total, 18 executions were actually completed this year. and only 22 new death sentences were handed out. Those who were executed also had glaring vulnerabilities. Many of them had serious mental illnesses. Some were intellectually disabled. Others had histories of traumatic childhoods, while a few were killed for crimes that they committed as teenagers. The systemic problem of the death penalty might also have a role to play. 2 death row prisoners were exonerated this year. This just further rekindled the fears that innocent peoples could be sent to death. All of this makes one thing clear: America's system of punishments needs some reform. Innocence must be protected at all costs. But what about those who actually committed crimes? Don't they deserve a little more humanity in their final moments? WION World is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news updates on the move.